Welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a story for you today that honestly feels way less like your standard history lesson and a whole lot more like a Hollywood thriller. I want you to completely transport yourself back to the early 1600s. It's the age of sail. It's an era where the scent of exotic spices carried on the wind could quite literally change the fate of empires. Today we're going to explore the unprecedented ambition, the absolutely dramatic rise, and ultimately the spectacular, catastrophic fall of a legendary empire of commerce. We are looking at the architect of global commerce.
Just imagine a single, solitary entity that grew so ridiculously powerful, so unimaginably vast, that it literally struck fear into the hearts of actual sovereign governments. And we aren't talking about a military junta here, or some rogue nation-state. No, this was a singular organization that forced European monarchs, Asian emperors, and powerful local sultans to sit down and negotiate with it as an absolute equal. It had world leaders nervously looking over their shoulders, knowing for a fact that this entity could blockade their ports or bankroll their enemies at a moment's notice.
To even wrap our heads around how this kind of global intimidation was possible, we have to talk about the money. And I mean a mind-bending amount of money. If we took the riches of this entity at its absolute peak and measured them by today's standards, we aren't just talking about billionaire status. At its height, its valuation was estimated at nearly $8 trillion in modern dollars. $8 trillion! That's more than the market caps of Apple, Google, and Microsoft combined. We're talking about a treasury that easily stood toe-to-toe with the entire economies of modern developed nations.
Now, hearing a valuation of $8 trillion, seeing a global reach that spanned oceans, and knowing the absolute terror it generated among royalty, you'd naturally assume we are talking about a mighty country, right? Well, here is the stunning twist. This massive, terrifyingly wealthy force wasn't a nation at all. It was a private business. Specifically, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, better known as the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. It was the world's very first publicly traded megacorporation.
So how on earth did a mere business pull this off? We have to look at the reality of the 17th century world. It was deeply, inherently fractured. It was divided geographically by these perilous, multi-month ocean voyages around the Cape of Good Hope, where crews routinely faced scurvy and shipwrecks. It was also divided politically by fiercely competing empires like the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the British. But despite these massive global divisions and mortal dangers, the entire world was united by one consuming obsession: money. Specifically, the pursuit of extreme wealth driven by an insatiable European demand for Asian goods like silk, pepper, mace, and nutmeg.
So the crucial point is this pivot right here. What started out as a simple commercial opportunity completely snowballed into absolute global domination. Take the city of Jakarta, for example, which the VOC renamed Batavia. At first, the company just asked the local ruler for a simple, tiny plot of land to build a little warehouse to store their spices. Well, within a few short years, that humble warehouse had been quietly but heavily reinforced into a stone fortress bristling with cannons. This was a highly calculated, dramatic turn from a mere business venture into an all-consuming, world-spanning empire.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer today. 1. A machine of wealth. 2. How the empire began. 3. Opportunity becomes global domination. 4. Strategy behind the power. And 5. A legacy that matters.
All right, let's dive into Section 1, a machine of wealth. While traditional empires were incredibly distracted, loudly fighting these bloody wars over European borders and aristocratic titles, the VOC took a completely different path. They operated in the background, quietly inventing an unprecedented financial machine to fund their massive fleets. I mean, they essentially established the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Instead of relying on a single wealthy king to fund a super risky voyage, the VOC fractionalized the risk. An everyday baker, a blacksmith, or a merchant in Amsterdam could buy a tiny share of the company's next voyage. This brilliant financial engineering created just a continuous, overflowing river of capital. While nations were building armies with taxed gold, the VOC built a self-sustaining economic engine through public investment.
Which brings us to Section 2, how the empire began. Let's see how this all builds up. This calculated rise happened in 3 distinct phases. Step 1, seizing opportunity in a fractured world. The Portuguese had previously dominated the spice trade, but their grip was slipping, and that left a highly lucrative gap in the global market. Step 2, building the machine. The Dutch filled this exact gap by pulling their capital through that revolutionary joint stock model we just talked about, which allowed them to send heavily outfitted fleets directly to the East Indies. And that directly enabled Step 3, establishing domination. Once they arrived, they didn't just play nice and trade fairly. They used their massive, well-funded ships to enforce absolute monopolies, violently pushing out competitors and completely dictating prices. Moving right along to Section 3, opportunity becomes global domination.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the sheer terrifying scope of control they achieved across three distinct pillars. First, they actively controlled global trade by ruthlessly securing monopolies. If an island wouldn't sell exclusively to the VOC, the company would simply burn their spice crops to the ground to artificially restrict the supply. Second, they actively influenced international politics. The Dutch government actually granted the VOC sovereign powers. Think about that. A private company had the legal right to wage wars, negotiate treaties, mint its own coins, and employ a private standing army of over 10,000 mercenaries. And third, by wielding this military and economic might, they permanently altered history, establishing vast colonies from Cape Town in South Africa all the way to the Indonesian archipelago. They were essentially a government for hire, just pulling the strings of the entire world.
Next up is Section 4, strategy behind the power. The contrast in strategy here is staggering. You have sovereign nations engaging in chaotic, conflict-driven strategies, bleeding their treasuries completely dry for fleeting territorial prestige. Meanwhile, the VOC's strategy was entirely focused, cold, and calculated. Secure monopolies at literally any human or financial cost and relentlessly maximize shareholder dividends. But, and this is crucial, this exact ruthless wealth-building strategy sowed the seeds of their spectacular ruin. Remember, this is a story of a dramatic rise, but also a devastating fall. The VOC simply expanded way too far, stretching their supply lines across the globe. Their relentless, unchecked pursuit of profit bred massive internal corruption. In fact, people actually started joking that VOC stood for Vergaan under corruption, which translates to perished by corruption. Employees were engaging in rampant illegal private trading, smuggling goods right under the company's nose. To keep up appearances, the directors just kept paying out massively high dividends to shareholders, even when the company was bleeding money. Finally, when the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War devastated their fleet in the 1780s, the hollowed-out, corrupt shell of the company shattered. The most powerful corporation in human history collapsed entirely under its own weight, going formally bankrupt in 1799.
And that leads us to our final part, Section 5, a legacy that matters.
The physical ships of the VOC might have rotted away, and their literal empire crashed and burned, but their shadow? It is absolutely still looming over our modern era. The blueprints laid down by this one relentless business venture survived its massive collapse. Because when you have an entity that successfully invented the stock market, established the very first multinational supply chains, and completely normalized the concept of corporate lobbying and private monopolies, that kind of architecture doesn't just vanish. The very DNA of modern capitalism, the board of directors, the concept of limited liability, the absolute prioritization of shareholder returns, it was all forged by the Dutch East India Company. They essentially wrote the instruction manual for the corporate-driven global economy that we all navigate right now.
So, as we look around today at the sheer scale of the trillion-dollar megacorporations operating in our own interconnected world, seeing how they shape our politics, control our digital infrastructure, and dictate global trade, it leaves us with a pretty chilling question. Could a single business rule the world again today? Something to really think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.